Welcome back, Exiles. It's Naidra. Today, I wanted to show you guys one of the easiest and cheapest builds to use in the game for a Sorceress. Now, I will say I have tried out many different Sorceress builds in this game so far, and I've come down to two of my favorites. One of them being the Autocast Comet, which you guys have previously seen in my videos, and then the other one, and I know what you guys are going to say, we've seen the Spark Stormweaver build 100,000 times before, but with this one specifically, it's really easy to use, and the gear is very generic to the point where it's completely interchangeable with other builds as well, making it super easy to switch over to this. But like I mentioned, it's also probably one of the cheapest ones you're going to be able to get that's going to be as effective as this is. Now, with that being said, this build is able to handle all endgame content, and it's really easy, and honestly, I really consider this to be one of the laziest builds that you can possibly have. I don't want to say that it's OP because I don't want it to necessarily get nerfed, but you know, it's handling stuff really easy. So I'll leave that to you and you decide what to do with that. Now, with that being said, today I'm going to show you guys exactly what that looks like. We'll take a look and see what it can do. And then after that, we'll come back to the hideout. We'll take a look at our equipment, our skill tree, and all of that other good stuff as well. But before we dive into it, if you have not yet subscribed, please don't forget to click that subscribe button below. Also, if you guys haven't had the opportunity to check out our merch store, be sure to check that out in the bio as well. That really would greatly help me out, and that's the best way you can possibly support the channel. So let's go ahead and dive right in. Alrighty, so let's go ahead and jump into a map, and we'll just do a tier 15. That's really all I have right now anyways, and we'll juice it up a little bit so that way we know it's not going to be the easiest thing that we can possibly do. And before we dive into it, so the way that this build is going to work is it's very similar to most of the other Spark builds in the way that it operates. We're going to mainly just be casting Spark most of the time. Typically, I do like to use Firewall just because that boosts our damage output, but most of the time we really don't have time to activate all of our skills, so you really should only be using probably 2, maybe 3 at a time at most. You probably would be fine just using Spark too, but just to keep it safe and to make it a little bit quicker, that's the way that we're going to do it. So let's go ahead and jump in. And we are also using Blink with this build. That just gives us an extra layer of security, which is really nice to make sure that we survive. Also, too, this makes it a little bit faster to speed farm if that's what you're looking to use this build for. But let's go ahead and take a look and see what this does. So we'll just throw up some Orb of Storms, Firewall, and we'll start casting our Spark. Make it super quick and easy. Our enemies are going to be dead before we normally even get to them anyways. But again, this is why I call this the super lazy and easy to use build, because we're really not in any danger at any point at all as we're going through these maps. And the same can be said when we're going up against bosses, but you really are able to quickly take pretty much everything out, including elite monsters as we just did here. So once again, let's take another look, see if we can find another group. Super quick and easy. As you can see, we're really not in any danger. We're not taking any damage either, but we're eliminating all these monsters before we normally even get into the room. So that's how this build is going to work. Like I mentioned, if you're in any danger, you can just quickly teleport back over, or you can blink back over to any other area, making this a little bit easier for you, so that way you're not dying and losing any of that experience, especially in the later part of the game. So let's go back to our hideout and take a look and see what's making this work. All right, so first, let's go ahead and start with our skills. So taking a look at our skills, we don't care about Chaos Bolt. That's just what came with our one, but we're really not using that at all. So we're just going to go right past that. Now, we do have Malice on here, and Malice we're getting from our Omen Scepter that we're using. It is really important to have because it is inflicting critical weakness to our enemies. So this is something that's going to be really valuable for this build. Next up, we've got Sigil of Power, and this is what's coming from our secondary weapon or our staff. This is really helpful to have, especially when we're going up against bosses. Now, we're not normally using this in AoE in most cases, but again, when you're going up against bosses, this is just going to add that additional layer of extra damage that we're doing, so it's really important to have this as well. Now then, for the star of the show, we are using Spark. Obviously, this is a Spark build, so definitely need to have this guy on here. Now, as you can see, I did increase the quality of this up to 20%. That makes it just that much more effective, so definitely recommend doing the same. And then we're going to pair this up with Considered Casting. We've also got Arcane Tempo. We're going to throw on Acceleration, Inspiration, and finally Persistence. Now, I have messed around with this a little bit and I've tried swapping this out for mobility. It is really helpful, especially once again, if you're using this for speed farming. So you can play around with it as well and swap out the persistence for mobility and see if that's helpful for you. Definitely enjoyed playing it that way. And like I said, it just makes it that much quicker, especially when you're using it for speed farming. Next up, we've got Flame Wall. Now, this one we're going to be pairing up with Fortress and then Spell Cascade. We've got Mana Tempest, which we're again not using very frequently, but we're going to pair this up with Premeditation. Next up, we've got Orb of Storms. And this one we're going to be pairing up with Lightning Exposure. We've got Font of Mana, Strip Away, and Conduction. And then we've also got Grim Feast. We don't need to add anything for this guy. We're going to use Conductivity, and we're going to pair that up with Focused Curse. We've got Heightened Curse and Hex Bloom. We're also using Archmage, which we're going to be pairing up with Lightning Mastery. We've got Blink, and we're going to pair this up with Second Wind. And again, this is what allows us to be able to blink twice. It's really important to have this because if you accidentally teleport into a huge crowd of monsters, you have the ability to back out pretty quickly without dying. So this is just another thing that we're going to be using to help us with the survivability aspect of this build. And then lastly, we've got Cast on Critical. And this one we're pairing up with an additional Spark. Then we've got Soul Drain and Fast Forward. Now, if you don't have as much spirit as I do, then the first thing to take out, in my opinion, would be to take out Cast on Critical. While it is really helpful to have the additional cast of Spark on here, the other ones are going to be a lot more helpful in terms of both survivability and also damage output as well. And as you can see, we've got 1, 2, 3, we've got 4 different skills that are persistent buffs on here, and that's thanks to the amount of spirit that we have. But if you have to choose one to take out, then I would recommend taking out Cast on Critical. And then taking a look at our character screen. Now, the big area of opportunity I have with this build right now is my fire resistance, which is only at 53%. I'm working on getting this fixed via my equipment, which, like I mentioned, the equipment that we're using is very, very generic and easy to use with other builds as well. And that's kind of the purpose of having the specific equipment, is I want to be able to try out different builds without having to go back into the shop and try to figure out what equipment I need and take all day trying to find just one item, especially considering how expensive some of these things are getting. So I keep mine very generic, but right now what we're working on in the area of opportunity we have is our fire resistance and a little bit of chaos resistance, which we can pretty easily fix via our equipment. Also, as you can see, we're a little bit overextended on our lightning resistance and our cold resistance. So if we can find that balance between the two, would be really helpful for us. But here is our character stats at the moment. Alrighty, and then taking a look at our equipment, starting off with our weapon, we're going to be using a wand for our primary weapon. And it really doesn't matter what type of a wand you have. We don't care about the Chaos Bolt at the top, so it doesn't really matter what kind of wand, as long as you have the stats below. Now, once again, just as a reminder, we are going to be using a very generic build. And like I mentioned before, this equipment you can use for basically any other build you want to, because we're not specifically going for things like lightning damage or fire damage. And to be quite honest, this is almost the exact same gear I used for my cast on minion death build for my comet build. And so this makes it super easy to change. And again, if you hate it, then switch over to something else. You don't have to worry about going back in the shop and purchasing more stuff. So that said, for our wand, we want to have increased spell damage as much as possible. We want to have maximum mana. We want to have at least +2 or more to all spell skills. We need some critical hit chance for spells. Again, we are using cast on critical as well, so this is going to be really helpful for that, and not to mention the additional damage output we're getting from this too. And then lastly, it is really important that we're getting mana per enemy killed. In AoE situations, this is what allows us to have our mana pretty much maxed out almost all of the time. So really, really helpful to have that there. Now for our secondary weapon, we are going to be using a chiming staff. We just need the sigil of power on here. We don't really care about the other stats, but we do want to make sure that specifically we've got a level 18 or higher sigil of power. And then for our offhand weapon, we are going to be using an Omen Scepter. I have increased the quality of the scepter up to 20% because previously when I was using this with a different build, I needed to have a little bit more spirit, and honestly, I actually still didn't get quite as much as I wanted to. However, in this case, we have a little bit of an overkill with the amount of spirit we have. We can still spare about 50, and that's after attaching our Grim Feast. We've got Cast on Critical, and on top of that, we're also using Blink. So there's multiple different things that are happening here. You don't need to have quite as much, like I mentioned, but you do want to have something that's got increased spirit. And then, of course, the malice portion of it really helps too. This inflicts critical weakness to our enemies, and that's super important to have for a caster build. And then the other things to look for when you're using a scepter is we want to have maximum mana on here. We do need some mana regeneration. As far as the strength is concerned, it's really helpful to have the strength, but it's not required. So if you find one that does not have strength on it, that should be just fine as well. And then next up, we'll take a look at our gloves. So for our gloves, we have a pretty generic pair here as well. We want to have some increased energy shield. We need some maximum life. We need maximum mana. And then if possible, we want to have as much resistances on here as possible. For right now, I just have fire resistance and chaos resistance. And then just like our primary weapon, if we can get additional mana per enemy killed, really, really helpful, especially because we're constantly using mana. And then for our first ring, we are using a prismatic ring. Now, if you have a breach ring, that would probably be even more helpful and a lot more powerful than this. So that would be really great. But for the purpose of keeping this build really, really cheap and easy to attain, we're just going to be using a prismatic ring. This is really good for our resistances. We've got a good amount of mana that's on here as well. We've got some rarity of items found, increased cast speed, more elemental resistances, and mana per enemy killed. Now, out of all of those things on here, the ones that are really important to have is going to be the maximum mana, we need the cast speed, and we need the elemental resistances, and lastly, the mana per enemy killed. You can do without the rarity of items found, and you can definitely do without the fire damage to attacks as well, but the other things we absolutely need to have to make sure this is as effective as we want it to be. And then for our helmet, so we're going to use a helmet that's got maximum energy shield. We want increased energy shield. We want max life, max mana. And then if you can, get something with triple resistances. Again, this is the best way to max out on all of your resistances. In this case, if we can swap out our cold resistance for fire resistance, that would be able to perfectly balance out our resistances overall. But we do want to have something that's got triple resistances if possible. For our chest armor, we are going to be using something that's got energy shield. We want to have max energy shield, increased energy shield. We need to have some maximum life. Now, at this point, you probably don't need to have the plus 43 to spirit because again, we are a little bit over our spirit that we need. However, it is helpful to have. Again, we're keeping our equipment very generic, and so that is absolutely fine, but that part is not necessary. And then the other part that's going to be necessary is we do need to have that triple resistance on here as well. For our belt, we are using the Midnight Braid Belt. Now, if you have Ingenuity, you definitely can use that, but it is a little bit more expensive, so we're not including that in here. You're also more than welcome to use a regular rare belt on here as long as you've got triple resistances, or at least the resistances that you need to make sure to get you to your maximum. And then, of course, if we can get some additional mana, that would be really helpful as well. For our amulet, now this is one that is required for this build, or at least it's really helpful to have, and that's the Everlasting Gaze. This is probably one of the more expensive pieces of items that we have on here at this time, but we definitely want to make sure that we're throwing that on there. For our second ring, we are using another prismatic ring. Again, the elemental resistances is super helpful. What we really need from this item is the maximum life and the elemental resistances. Now, having the attributes and the intelligence really helps because it allows us to make different decisions on our passive skill tree that are not necessarily going to impact us negatively. So really good to have, but those ones are not required. But again, we just want to make sure we've got something that gives us elemental resistances on here for now, and something that's cheap. Now, for our boots, we want to make sure we've got something that's got a high increased movement speed. We're currently using a 30% increased movement speed with these, and it is really, really helpful, and also really helps us with our survivability. And then next, we've got increased energy shield. We'll take all the energy shield that we possibly can, so this is great. This is also giving us 166 to maximum mana, and that's really, really good to have. We definitely can take advantage of that. And then we've got cold resistance, lightning resistance, and stun threshold. We absolutely can do without the stun threshold. I would have preferred to have another resistance on here. If you can get some that have triple resistance, that's going to be even more helpful. All right, so that being said, let's go ahead and take a look at our passive skill tree. So starting off with our Ascendancy, we're going to go over to the right and grab Elemental Damage along with Scouring Winds. And then on the left, we're going to take Mana, Constant Gale, Mana again, and then Force of Will. And then lastly, we'll take Shock Chance and we'll also take Strike twice. Now then, we'll go ahead and make our way up towards the right-hand side and we'll stop at Pure Energy. We'll also grab the 3 nodes on the left, including Practiced Signs. We'll continue making our way up on the right-hand side, stopping for Mana Blessing, Dampening Shield, and Rapid Recharge. And then we'll continue going up and we'll stop over at Sudden Escalation. And then we'll continue going over to the left-hand side where then we're going to stop and grab Touch of the Arcane. We're also going to be grabbing Mind Over Matter, Breaking Point, Storm Charged, All Natural. We'll also grab Calibration as well as Desensitization. And then we'll make our way back over to the right-hand side where then we're going to stop for Branching Bolts. We're also going to grab Eldritch Battery. We'll then grab Ether Flow, Arcane Intensity, along with Raw Mana. We'll make our way up to the left, where then we're going to be grabbing Pure Power Conduction, Electric Amplification. And of course, we're going to grab Patient Barrier and Ingenuity. And then we'll make our way over to the right, where we'll grab a couple more nodes. Specifically, we needed some additional strength, so we stopped here. But we also went ahead and grabbed Turn the Clock Forward. And then once you've gotten all of those, we'll then make our way down and we'll finish it up here where we'll grab For the Jugular. And then we're also going to end up grabbing Deadly Force as well. So with that said, that is what our passive skill tree looks like. And that's all I have for you guys for today. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment below. And until next time, Exiles.